In the gospel, we hear of some Greeks that have come to worship at the Passover. These Greeks were converts from the old traditions, the religions of many gods. But they were pious folk of goodwill who nevertheless believed in one God and in a Messiah to come from Israel. In those times, there had been whispers throughout the Mediterranean world that a great hero would usher in a new time, an age of peace. Some thought it would be a Roman emperor. Others speculated that a wise man would illuminate human minds. Recently, a journalist has put together a video describing the life of Jesus in a novel way. Using clips from an old silent film of Christ's life that used simple props, he suggests that the Gospels are outdated, the Christ story merely propped up and designed by the evangelists. But what it is really a kind of nature myth. Such documentaries are done in a very convincing way and are deceptive. The point is to prove that Jesus' life is a religious drama whose symbols are borrowed from pre-Christian myth. Well, the hero gods were said to be the sons of gods, who are martyred and die in sacrificial way, according to the ancient pagan stories. And so they descend to the land of the dead under the earth, just like the sun as it appears to slip below the western horizon. Then they rise again in triumph, like the morning sun. To anyone who is familiar with mythology, it is a familiar theme. The immortal heroes were cultural icons of the ancient world, like the famous heroes that are so popular today, such as Harry Potter or Indiana Jones. Early writers like the Church Fathers were well aware of the close connection that religion must maintain to nature and her cycles. Church writers elaborated on these old mythic parallels in order to demonstrate the universal themes and symbols. But to identify Christ as an ancient hero god would have been as absurd as a modern historian trying to explain away Abraham Lincoln's presidency as if it were a mythological kingship. The Church Fathers realized that the old cultures had been prepared by providence for the coming of the Messiah. Nature is our first teacher, and God has placed signs of Christ in all things. Our Creator, in His mercy, did not deny wisdom to early man, for although they could not receive revelation like we have, all humans are made to worship God. So all humans have traces of the divine story infused into their souls. The mark of the Creator, a sort of subconscious roadmap for right living. These traces would surface into thoughts, dreams, and storytelling as dying and rising nature gods. Such representations do not cast doubt on Christ's resurrection, but reveal our humanity from earliest ages and the universal expectation of a Messiah entering into history. The heroes were models which foreshadowed the final reality of He who was to come. Jesus Christ, who was crucified, died, and rose again, conqueror of sin and death. Many today who consider themselves educated, however, turn away from the truth and from righteousness, and as St. Paul says, when speaking of the end times, They will follow after myths and fables. Mythology is misused to manufacture a disingenuous thesis that the Christ story was fabricated by the gospel writers, and Christ is no different than mythical heroes. They shamefully overlook the reality that is undeniable, that the historical authenticity of an earth-shaking Christ cannot be reasonably contested. None of the many parallel myths they compare carry the unique world-changing significance of Christ's life, and none of the hero gods spoke as Christ spoke, of the one true God, of faith and love, the highest virtues. And what sort of God speaks of his own death and resurrection, as we hear Christ prophesying in today's reading? Surely it is good for us to meditate on the importance of dying and rising again in the footsteps of Christ. In fact, we must all model our lives in some way after the story of Christ's life. His fasting and prayer, his hour of trial, his passion and death. Inasmuch as we live in communion with the Church and participate in her liturgical year of sacred rites, which correspond to the cycles of nature, Lent, Easter, Ordinary Time, and Advent. Inasmuch as we participate in these, we achieve imitation of Christ. In these times, we no longer learn the divine patterns from a mere dream or dim reflection, some ancient demigod. No, our God comes in the full light of day, in whom there is no darkness. No hero story other than this one is needed, for we have the truth himself, the archetype from which any other model of transformation must be derived. The heroic lives of the saints testify to this truth. It is Christ, he who is living and who abides forever, who speaks to us today and who says, "Amen, amen, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit." This is the dying and rising that Christ himself speaks of, namely, that we die to ourselves, our own narrow ways, and take up his ways instead, and live by his law of love, obeying him and receiving an interior consolation. In so doing, it is not we who live any longer, but it is he who lives in us.